Zana Health Lab is brought to you by Leafly, the world's largest cannabis information resource. Consumers and patients get more from cannabis at Leafly.
Welcome to Zana Medical's Health Lab. Jeremy, what is Health Lab?
So Health Lab is a weekly... Oh, it's not a weekly series.
That's okay. I'm Seth Lorenzi.
And I'm Jeremy Cosson.
You're listening to Zana Medical's Health Lab. Health Lab is a podcast in episodic series format. Each series focuses on a specific medical condition, in this case insomnia, and then each episode examines the condition through the eyes of a specific population, in this case, veterans, who experience insomnia at an alarming rate, usually as a symptom of other underlying issues. We're going to hear first from Roger Martin. He's a former Army vet, and he's also a former law enforcement officer.
Well, basically, the long story short is that when OxyContin first hit the market, that was a drug of choice that I was given for chronic pain. And by October 2010, I was taking 180 milligrams of that a day and 40 milligrams of Ambien to be able to sleep 1 to 2 hours at night.
I got to tell you, Jeremy, each and every time I hear that clip, it just gives me chills.
I know, and we hear it again and again and again. I think it's probably prominent in a lot of different populations, but does seem almost disproportionately to affect veterans. Is like ending up on this sort of cocktail of really heavy drugs.
Absolutely. I want to push ahead into the next clip. It's a window into a life very different from the one that I get to lead. This is a fellow you talked to a few times, Jeremy. I'll let him tell his own story.
Let's hear from Jake.
Yeah, let's hear it from Jake.
Benzos, depressants, a lot of painkillers. I was also on atypical antipsychotics, for sleep. That's basically, I was taking 600 milligrams of Seroquel every night to sleep. And I never thought I would get off that. I would tell my dad, tell my girlfriend, I'm never going to get off this, or I'm never going to sleep.
Yeah, I'm never going to sleep. That is, again, that's totally chilling. We just heard from Jake Scallen. Jake is an Iraq War veteran, and he currently works with the Santa Cruz Veterans Alliance, which is a cannabis co-op. So veterans have a lot of challenges that are really specific to their population. I want to dig down, again, through the lens of insomnia and clinical cannabis, but I want to kind of detangle what goes on for this population, what makes them special in this way. Maybe you can lead us off. What are some challenges that are specific to vets?
So when we're talking about veterans, obviously they have sort of a unique situation among the population. We've had 2 ongoing wars where they've been deployed, coming back.
The longest wars.
The longest wars, yeah.
In this country's history.
Yeah, remarkably long. So coming back from that and transitioning to civilian life is a huge difficulty, a huge challenge in and of itself. And so they're often facing, they get back and
kind of environmental challenges,
there's
if you will.
Environmental challenges. Then you'd hear about sort of death count and stuff like that, right? But you don't hear about all these other injuries, and because actually we save so many more, far fewer
people die on the battlefield.
Than they used to, but they're coming back with other wounds, and so it could be chronic pain, it could be PTSD, and insomnia ties into that a lot. So because we know that both chronic pain and PTSD are a huge cause.
They're major
of insomnia.
Causes. Well, not to mention anxiety.
And anxiety, yeah, exactly. Anxiety. So all of these, huge. Different things that happened when they were deployed really exacerbate what we're talking about.
And
I want to bring up insomnia.
I want to bring up for female vets too, sexual assault.
And sexual assault
that happens on active duty is incredibly common and incredibly underreported as well.
Yeah, it is underreported.
Okay, so in previous episodes, we've talked a lot about clinical cannabis and its potential beneficial effects for insomnia. Not everyone that we talk to has a positive experience, but in our view, and we like to posit ourselves as skeptics, clinical cannabis definitely has a potentially major role to play in fighting insomnia. So given that, what about vets and cannabis? Are there challenges specific to their getting clinical cannabis?
Well, absolutely, because they fall under, it's kind of a gray area, right? Because as I mentioned, about half the states or a little bit over half the states have legal medical cannabis, but they're also dealing with a federal system, right? The VA.
Right, that tension, which has still not been resolved.
Mm-hmm. So there's the tension between sort of federal statute and state laws that are evolving. So we've had so many different political, they've tried to change the laws, and so many, they've had a lot of bills go through Congress that looked like they were going to be helpful, and then they get killed ultimately.
Right. I've read little bits about that. Should we play that audio, as a matter of fact? Okay.
People were not happy when the State Board of Health rejected a proposal to add post-traumatic stress syndrome to the list of medical problems that can be treated with medical marijuana. Hours of testimony from veterans and sexual assault survivors could not change the board's mind.
Colorado, right?
And that's Colorado. So that's
which has legalized adult use.
Exactly. So that's what's so bizarre to a lot of people is that Colorado, which has legal adult use, they have not approved.
Were they first
for adult use recreational? Yes.
Yeah.
They were the first to legalize it completely for recreational, but it's not for veterans. It's not
because
just
the VA is a federal body.
Well, it doesn't have to do that aspect doesn't necessarily have to do with the federal aspect of it, but they still want, there's certain medical benefits and stuff like that, or certain things that it enables them to do if it is a qualifying condition.
Right,
and also being able to talk to your doctor about it and everything like that. But having it recognized clinically is different than just having it recreational.
Well, that also touches on qualifying conditions. I know for many non-vets, qualifying conditions are a big deal. Basically, where in the country is your condition recognized as a candidate for cannabis treatment? And insomnia, as we know, is not often recognized.
Right. Both insomnia and PTSD. I mean, PTSD is increasingly being recognized. There's been some study. New Mexico did a great study.
Mm-hmm.
There's a study from Israel that's really good.
Which state is that?
Oh, Israel, right?
That's my first state.
Yeah, that's the 50. And then Dr. Sue Sisley, it took her 7 years basically to get her study approved. It's now been approved by the FDA and the DEA.
What is her study?
So her study is looking at they're looking at 3 different types of cannabis strains. So a high CBD, a high THC, and an equal ratio. And so it's like the first actual federally approved study that's looking at botanical cannabis. So it's a pretty big deal, but it took years and years and years before it could finally get approved.
Yeah. Okay. So we touched on the VA, and while this is not an explicitly political podcast, we have to touch on this because the VA is most vets' conduit to care. As provided by their service. So what's the deal? There's some institutional drag in the VA when it comes to providing vets with clinical cannabis. Are those laws or statutes, or are they sort of institutional policies? What makes it so hard for vets to get clinical cannabis through the VA?
Well, the first big step was for the VA, for the doctors to be able to freely talk about cannabis as an option with their, with
You mean they weren't allowed to talk about it?
No, they weren't even allowed to talk about it. And that, they went through Congress and introduced a bill, and it passed a couple different times, and then it got killed again. And then also there's changing perceptions. So, and Jake talks about that a bit too, and so does Roger. A couple years ago, you did not want to even talk to your physician about cannabis at all, and because they didn't see it as actually therapeutic, they thought, they're just abusing.
It's merely an illicit drug.
Right.
They're abusing it.
Exactly, which is ridiculous because at the same time, doctors are freely handing out, prescribing all sorts, heavy antipsychotics, heavy sort of, narcotic medications, anxiety, benzodiazepines, all these different things that are addictive as well.
And I guess, again, this touches on a larger issue of the opioid epidemic. I don't have figures in front of me, but I'm guessing that vets constitute a really large portion of the people affected by that. And I know that the rate of vet death by overdose and by suicide, which is concurrent with all these, is incredibly high. Shockingly high. These all tied together.
Right. There's 22 veterans per day that commit suicide. And actually, they say the number that they quote is actually even higher than that. It could be approaching 50 if you count sort of accidental overdoses from benzodiazepines or from narcotics, opioids.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, that's a lot to chew on. Needless to say, we're going to get back with some veteran stories, and we're going to bring in a lot of the clinicians that we talk with on this subject as well, because it's a big, complicated topic. But we want people to know that there's a way through these issues. These are not dead ends by any means. They're complicated. They're tangled. Cannabis, insomnia, mental health. There's so many threads together. But our goal with this podcast is to give you, the listeners, some notion that you have agency. There's something you can do. There's guidance that you can seek, and there's a process you can follow to try to get actual relief for your condition.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Seth.
Yeah. All right, here we go. Welcome to segment 2.
Seth, how you doing?
I'm still good.
It's been a long time.
It seems like hours, but it's been minutes.
It's been minutes, yeah.
Right.
No, I think it's been hours, but
It actually has.
in real time.
So we've introduced some topics. We're talking about vets in this episode. In this segment, we're going to get deeper into patient stories and learn a little bit more about what they deal with on a day-to-day basis. We've met Roger Martin. We've met Jake Scallen. Let's hear from Roger specifically on some of the ways in which the painkillers and meds he was given were letting him down.
Well, yeah, the insomnia was the big, just a big issue. Pain too had a lot to do with it. But tell you the truth, after I stopped taking 180 milligrams a day of OxyContin, I was actually in less pain then than I was when I was taking it. So my system had built up such a high tolerance to it that it really wasn't doing any good. And doctors admit now that that opiates are absolutely 0% effective in treating chronic pain. They're great for acute pain.
Right. So Roger's story is fairly emblematic. I mean, a lot of people talk about the deficiencies of pharmaceuticals for long-running chronic conditions, especially something like insomnia, which is so prevalent among vets.
Well, insomnia and chronic pain.
And chronic pain.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that begs the question, well, leaving Cannabis out of the story for now, what does work? I mean, if these hundreds of thousands of vets and other people are being prescribed these pharmaceuticals, and we haven't heard many outright success stories, what is working for them? Is there anything that we can
for the
recommend?
pain? Well, yeah. I mean, for the pain, that's a tough one. But one of the big things that comes up is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right.
But in terms of like actual drugs themselves, most of them have way more adverse effects than they do actually positive effects.
Wow. Okay, let's jump to Jake. He has a similar experience, different substance.
And I know, like, when I drink a lot, it only only made those negative feelings worse. Like, my family background is Irish. My grandma came over from Ireland in the 60s. And, Irish, drunken poets always like talking about like sad shit, and that's kind of who I was for the longest time. And, alcohol only made it worse.
Yeah, that's pretty blunt. But also I think it's incredibly common, right?
Well, that's an important thing to note, because probably like the number one drug that people will abuse, particularly
I was just going to say that. I mean, alcohol
is alcohol because it's there.
We barely mention it in this series, but it is the most commonly available drug, if you want to look at it in that perspective.
Right. And what they generally people say is that it may help them like numb. So momentarily it might be good, but it always worsens things and it always exacerbates the situation.
I was just going to say, I was going to talk about it as an uninhibitor, but I don't think that would have application here.
You mean like an elixir?
I'm just thinking about all the different things that alcohol does for you. I mean, it's a stimulant.
And a sedative.
And it's a depressive.
Mm-hmm.
I guess
or depressant,
point, yeah. I mean, I guess my point being that alcohol is in and of itself not a simple drug. There's a lot of forces at work.
Actually, yeah, it is. It's really complex. Also, if you look at in terms of how all the different neurotransmitters and different reward pathways that it affects, it's extremely complex, actually.
So we've heard from both Roger and Jake, and they're contending with a number of issues. Insomnia, of course, but as we know, insomnia is often not the root cause. It's a symptom of underlying problems. I want to play this next clip from Jake, in which he talks about some much, much deeper issues, and ones that we as civilians really don't have to think about. This really grabbed me. I want to point out Jake at this point has found cannabis, and he's integrating it into his treatment. He's getting relief from that, but that's not the end of the story. Okay, let's play that.
For me, cannabis use, it's like I could breathe again. Like we're talking about like hypertension and like being always on lookout and hypervigilant. It feels like you could kind of check that shit at the door and not just worry, basically. It just slows you down, and it slows you down in a good way. It's like driving a manual car, I feel like I'm in second gear, on the red line, like all the time. Like, and then all of a sudden, you just smoke this plant or eat an edible or whatever, and it feels like time stops and you could breathe in your chest again, and you could actually look around and just see things around you instead of focusing like, oh, someone could be hiding there, or there could be a dude right there, or that guy looks kind of shady. You just put it all by the wayside.
That was a long clip, but I really wanted to play all of it. That really struck me again, just how different his experience is from mine, and the sort of, we all deal with day-to-day stimuli when we're out in the world. There's what we perceive as dangers or threats or things that may reward us or give us pleasure. But I think of that perception of the world being so kind of amped up by his conditions.
Right. Well, he's talking about hypervigilance, which is really common. It's part of PTSD, but it also contributes to the insomnia. And,
right. And
then also, can later manifest into nightmares and all these different things that impact sleep.
Yeah. So Jake has some challenges. Let's move back to Roger, because he hits on something I think fairly important. He hits upon an institutional issue, which I think is important. We touched on it earlier, and it's the VA and their general approach to cannabis. And here, we'll just play that audio.
A few years later, I was training our male German Shepherd at a training facility. I started running into a lot of young people who were experiencing similar problems with pain and insomnia and PTSD, TBI, who told me that cannabis was the only thing that ever helped them sleep, for example. I know that's what we're talking about today, so I'll try to focus on that. The only thing that really helped them get a good night's sleep. And the problem was, especially for the younger veterans, was the fact that the VA gives them pills that are free, and cannabis costs money. Whether it's getting your car, going to the doctor so you can get a recommendation or whatever you need in your particular state, or just acquiring the medical cannabis that you need, to deal with your insomnia. It's a very expensive proposition. So a lot of these young veterans find themselves in a position where, they have an option pretty much. It's either take the free pills that the VA, hands them, or and then buy their kid maybe a new pair of shoes to start school this year, or they can buy the cannabis and the kid has to go without shoes. Well, obviously, very few people do that.
Yeah, again, it's a long clip, but he touches on a lot of really deep issues there. I mean, first of all, the VA's reluctance to prescribe cannabis, but they're willing.
Well, they can't.
They can't, sure, okay. But they're focused on pharmaceuticals and the economic implications for people, economic implications for veterans, for the end users, and also, this is outside the scope of this podcast, perhaps, but the economic impact on the pharmaceutical companies, who obviously are contracted to supply these drugs. But okay, back to the patients. Here's one story we wanted to share with you because it's so common, not necessarily among veterans, among everyone who is cannabis naive, and that's the question of overdosing. And as we've discussed, cannabis is essentially non-toxic to humans. But if you have too much and in the wrong way, you will suffer some very unpleasant side effects. And Roger, who was cannabis naive, at the beginning of this experience had a really poignant one. Let's listen to that.
And I was fortunate it worked. My first experience was pretty hysterical, I guess, if you want to, or for a lack of a better label for it. Like most people, I know pretty much everybody's had a funny or bad or whatever experience with edibles, only because the people I bought it from were very uneducated and didn't really tell me how much I should take. And I bought that from at a dispensary in South Lake Tahoe. Some guy, I guess, a blonde-haired hippie guy behind the counter, and I asked him, I bought these cookies and tincture and candy, and asked him how much of the cookie I should eat. Well, I should just eat a little bit, and if you don't feel anything in a while, eat some more. And so I had about a 45-minute drive. So anyway, I ate about a quarter of it in the parking lot. I got my, took off on my way home, and 10 minutes later I hadn't felt anything, so I ate another half. And by the time I got home, I think I'd eaten 2 cookies. And I was supposed to be on a plane out of Reno at 5 o'clock the next morning. And I made the flight. I don't remember how, but about 11 o'clock that night, I was very fortunate that my 2 youngest sons happened to be staying with me that night. And because I told them, I said, I'm dying, you guys. I'm having a heart attack. You guys got to take me to the hospital. And they kept reassuring me I was fine. But, man, I don't even remember the flight or the first day I was there. But
yeah, not a great introduction to cannabis for anyone, and not a great introduction to cannabis for an Army vet and former law enforcement officer.
Right.
Confirming.
I know, considering his background as law enforcement and a veteran, he was already extremely skeptical about cannabis in the first place. He did have, he really wanted to get off of these pharmaceutical drugs, so he was willing to give it another shot.
Well, yeah, as you said, it's kind of remarkable that he stuck with it.
I think it speaks to the need to have a formal process and protocol in place, and that's what we do. Obviously, at Zana, these are the questions that we consider, that we ponder all the time. Is like, how do you optimize the experience so that you can get the best results without having to do, as we said, sort of a haphazard trial and error.
Yeah, or the bad trips.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeremy.
Sounds good. Thanks, Seth.
Next, we're going to listen to some clinicians and get their perspective on what these vets are going through.
Be sure to visit zanahealthlab.com/insomnia3. That's zanahealthlab.com/insomnia and the number 3 to access show notes from today's episode, plus all sorts of free resources and downloads. You'll also find a free sleep journal and a list of free resources for veterans. Again, the URL is zanahealthlab.com/insomnia3.
So there's really 2 issues here. There's the rewarding effect of THC, and then there's also the dependence based on tolerance. And so I'll address the rewarding effect first. Some of us, based on our genetics and also based on our previous life experience, do have a predisposition towards addictive behavior. And for those people who know this about themselves, it's important that they avoid experiences that are strongly rewarding or highly pleasurable.
That's Dr. Justin Sulak. He's a leading expert on clinical cannabis, and he's broaching a subject that we haven't touched yet, but we think it's time. It's the addictive potential of cannabis.
And it's important to cover because cannabis, as we know, is less addictive than a lot of substances. You know that 9% of people that try cannabis will develop a dependency, whereas alcohol, nicotine, a lot of prescription drugs are, 1.5 to 2.5, 3 times as addictive. But it does obviously it's a substance, so it carries addictive potential.
Well, as you pointed out earlier, nothing is truly safe.
Exactly.
Right?
Nothing's truly safe.
Yeah. Okay, let's hear a little bit more.
Now this could be drugs like cocaine, it could also be food that's full of sugar and salt and fat. It could be gambling and other experiences like that. And it could also be THC, and when it comes to THC, I would encourage people that have an addictive background to be most careful with inhalation because it gives you this rapid onset, and with that rapid onset, there's a strong rush of pleasure usually, and that can potentially trigger people into other pleasure-seeking behavior.
Well, I have to comment on one thing.
Yeah,
he mentioned gambling as being potentially addictive, and I don't know, for some reason, I can't fathom enjoying losing money. and nor would I want to do it again and again. That's probably why I don't gamble.
Yeah, no, it's never appealed to me. It scares me, to
Yeah.
be honest. I've been inside a casino, I think, exactly once in my life.
Funny thing is, I've been in casino dozens and dozens and dozens of times.
For the
I mean,
buffet?
I'm a big buffet guy. No,
Sure.
no, I love Vegas, but I just don't gamble. I'll maybe put a quarter in here and there at the slots, but in general, no, I don't really gamble.
Well, I mean, this is an interesting too, because it's a way of looking at pleasure seeking, which we don't think twice about. We gravitate towards rewarding activities, but this is looking at it on a chemical level.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're not going to get into the science today, but because it's highly complex and it varies from substance to substance, from activity to activity. But
I would fall asleep or start crying.
That's really, I could listen to it for 3, 4, 5 days straight.
Well, that's why we're the perfect co-hosts.
Yeah.
But I wanted to segue into Dr. Nick Jikomes, who we've heard from many times in this series, and let's let him pick up the thread here.
I would say generally, yeah. I mean, so cannabis does have some habit-forming potential. There's a lot of people who I think romanticize things a little bit too much and say that it's non-addictive. That's not true. I don't like to think about drugs as being addictive or non-addictive in a binary way like that. I think you need to think about their habit-forming potential on a spectrum that goes from really high for something like an opioid or nicotine down to relatively low. Or to zero. Some things are completely non-habit forming, but those are typically less interesting substances.
Right. My St. Joseph's Children's aspirin habit never really took off.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
I mean, I guess they're sweet and crunchy. So
I never got addicted to figs.
Fig addiction.
Fig addiction.
Right. It's no joke. It's real.
It's real. But one of the things I think, and I don't know if Dr. Sulak, he didn't mention it this time, but what I thought was interesting is actually form of administration and how that influences addictive potential.
That's true.
With smoking being a lot more addictive than oral consumption.
Well, and I wonder, I mean, is that experiential or is it mechanical?
No, it is.
You know what I mean?
It is mechanical because when you think about it, crack cocaine or freebase or
I don't
different
actually
things.
think about crack that often.
No, I don't think. I mean, I don't think about it like think about it, but but I think about it in the context of addiction. And those types of drugs all forms can be addictive, but those because the instant rush or intravenously, like with opioids and stuff like that, it's always more addictive. That route of administration because it's that instant. You're getting that instant reward. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of rewards, let's drill down into the science just a little bit more and hear Dr. Nick talking about why he believes cannabis is not as addictive.
Well, there's a number of reasons. There's two things I would basically say there. One, the mechanism of action. That's the first thing to always think about. Opioid receptors, those things, when you dig down into the nitty-gritty of their biology, those things are just hooked up to the reward system of the brain in a way that just makes them highly habit-forming because it feels so damn good to tickle those receptors. Things like THC are hooked up and do affect the what you would call the reward or the pleasure centers of the brain, but not in the same way as these things, or not quite as much more, basically. So that's part of why there is some abuse potential, but it's much lower than for something like opioids. They're tickling the pleasure centers, but just not quite as much, would be sort of the shortest, simplest way to think about it.
So, okay.
Tickling the pleasure centers. Don't forget that.
I'm forgetting it. I'm moving on. So cannabis is potentially addictive, not rising to the level of opioids, obviously, or many other...
Or alcohol.
Right, or
nicotine.
Thank you. Yeah, or many of these other very common substances. But that said, what are some other ways that veterans can access help? What are some other ways for them to look at treating insomnia and, of course, anxiety, PTSD, all the other conditions that are so common to their experience? We talked with Dr. Kim Babson, who I believe we've introduced earlier in the series, but she has some interesting tools regarding behavioral therapies.
Yeah, so the American Academy of Sleep Medicine kind of comes out with treatment recommendation guidelines for the treatment of insomnia, and their first line, recommendation for treating insomnia is really behavioral interventions, and they say that if if medication is needed, to kind of do it as an adjunct to behavioral treatments.
Right. Paige talked about CBT. A few people throughout this series have talked about CBT.
CBT is it's a recurrent theme for sure, and it's probably the best regarded evidence-based practice for whether we're talking about insomnia or whether we're talking about other different sort of psychiatric disorders. It's about modifying your sort of thought patterns and integrating different aspects so that to treat something without pharmaceuticals.
Is that the kind of thing you mentioned earlier? Not using your bed for things like watching TV, like making those associations. Does that touch on CBT, or am I just?
Well, that's more sleep hygiene.
Okay,
but no, it's more integrating different practices, exercises that help you, let's say, relax, help you sort of change your thought patterns or negative thought patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's essentially coping strategies that are drawn from behavioral and cognitive psychology.
Got it. Let's listen to a little bit more. One really neat thing that Dr. Babson works on are these apps. These are tools that people use via smartphones,
mobile
devices.
apps. Yeah. I don't think she programmed them herself, but I think she helped design them or helped create them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. So there's a suite of, I think, maybe 30 apps that have been developed now. The one that I'm most familiar with and have done some work with is called CBT iCoach, which is a mobile app that provides a treatment for a behavioral intervention for sleep. But they're currently working on one that will be a standalone, so be able to be delivered.
So that was a great explanation, and now we have a good understanding of what CBT is. And we're going to hear from Jake, who's used CBT and had some great success with it.
Right, as well as, he's been through the whole panoply of remedies.
Yeah, he's tried, great point. He's tried quite a few different things, but aside from cannabis, the one other thing I think he said that was actually extremely helpful, and certainly the evidence suggests that it is extremely helpful, and it's a great long-term strategy, is CBT. So let's listen to how it helped him.
I went through CBT, and like what I was talking about earlier, like smoking and kind of having a bad experience, it was actually like the CBT stuff that kind of got me through it and would like help me ground myself.
Oh, wow. So it was helpful?
Yeah, I think it was really helpful for sure. I think a lot of dudes though get, it's tough. CBT is really hard. I did CBT and prolonged exposure therapy, and they were really tough. It's like that incident in the hospital. Like I had to sit there and talk about that for, months on end, and it was really hard. And I'd have to sit there and go into the most minute detail about it over and over and over again. And then because it happened in a hospital, so I kind of had issues with going into a hospital. Like I got bit by a brown recluse spider when I was in Oklahoma, and I was so freaked out about going to the hospital and the doctors that it got kind of bad, and my friend basically forced me into the hospital because I had a rotting hole in my arm.
So it's funny that sparked a little connection for me too. I wasn't going to use this clip originally, but Dr. Babson says something about pills, that why we use pills first, and one reason is that they're easy, they tend to work quickly, and you swallow it, and that's it. And Jake is talking about the real challenge of incorporating CBT into his life. It takes work. You don't just take a pill. You have to do the work on an ongoing basis, right?
No, it's a great point, and that it is like everybody is kind of looking for the quick fix. And yeah, CBT it's great. It's a great long-term strategy, but it's not going to be an immediate fix.
Nor is cannabis the quick fix.
No.
Yeah.
Nothing's a quick fix. Or if it is a quick fix, it's a quick fix very briefly, and then it becomes really bad.
Yeah, I think with any type of medication that you take, it requires consistent monitoring in order to make sure that you're still getting the desired effect that you're wanting from it. To make sure that tolerance to that effect isn't developing, or and depending on medication, an addiction potential needs to be monitored very carefully, as well as side effects. Even in some of the most what seem to be not harmful, for lack of a better word, medications, you can still have side effects from them. And so it's just something that has to be consistently monitored by a provider.
Right. And obviously that goes for any medication whatsoever.
Exactly. That's the Zona program, by the way.
Right. I mean, that's
the guidance,
point of it.
That's the exact point of it.
Yeah.
But now this is a good time to also go in, I think a good segue to go into canna shaming, which actually came up quite a bit. And canna shaming, not everybody's, I don't even, is that actually a real term?
I don't know.
I've only recently
heard it. It doesn't roll off the tongue.
But, it's essentially people making people feel bad for treating with cannabis. Well, because it's not, because we still has that stigma. So, is that right? And should, how do we deal with that?
Yeah. Okay. Let's hear from Jake again.
I think, people think, oh, he just wants to get high. It's like that mindset. And it's just so frustrating. You see people look at you and they think you're a drug addict or you're like trying to hide from something, when even then they didn't even sign up and serve, So I think people think they see stoners or, just people who smoke, and I think they see laziness and that typical don't do nothing attitude. But it's, a lot of these people in this industry work really hard, to be who they are and to be a happy, healthy human being. And they don't even take the time to, notice that, or, it's just judging a book by its cover.
Yeah, no, it's interesting what Jake said about this sort of perception that people have of let's say, stoners, or they just want to get high sort of a thing. And to me, since I study, the sort of therapeutic properties so much, and I understand the complexity of the plant and our endocannabinoid system, it's a very legitimate medicine. But I think back, I long had that stigma towards it. And I said, stoners, lazy, because it's the total opposite of like my personality. Fortunately, it's changing, but perceptions do take a long time to change. And in his situation, and many of the people that we talk to, I mean, they don't meet your typical sort of stereotype that you see in the movies.
Fit the profile. Nurse Kathy Smith, who we've heard from before, has a response to that. Let's hear from her.
There are a couple patients that have come into the ED, and they are just so looked down upon by the majority of the physicians there, because they were just smoking weed and they smoked too much. And they are reluctant to treat them with anything. I actually had to have a conversation with a physician one day that was on, and I asked him flat out, I said, look, it looks like you're practicing judgment and not medicine. This guy needs help, and he does not feel well. He's extremely dehydrated because he has been vomiting, and he's extremely anxious. Like, he was rubbing his thighs, he was rocking, he was very diaphoretic, and we weren't doing anything for him because the doctor just said, oh, he just needs to sober up. But on the flip side, if somebody comes in and they are detoxing from alcohol or heroin or opiates, they have no hesitation giving them whatever they need, like Librium or Ativan or Suboxone or something else to help counteract those detox effects.
That's really interesting, actually.
On a lot of levels.
Yeah, on a lot of levels. I mean, she was talking about sort of a rare circumstance where somebody had
cyclic vomiting
cyclic
syndrome?
vomiting, which
I love saying that phrase.
Yeah, which is really rare, but it happens, I guess, in certain people.
Right. Okay. I want to wrap it up, and I want to bring the discussion back to insomnia. That's what this series is about, after all. I want to point out that, especially in this population, insomnia is often not the root of the problem, but it's one of the most visible and potentially most treatable symptoms of these larger problems that vets typically face. I'm thinking of PTSD, anxiety.
Chronic pain is common. I mean, there are injuries. Yeah. So, I mean, oftentimes insomnia it's actually kind of, I mean, it intersects with so many different types of conditions that are common among veterans, but it's often overlooked, interestingly.
I mean, I don't think I've ever heard someone say, well, I suffer from anxiety and PTSD, but I sleep really well.
Right. You don't often hear that. Exactly. And yeah, and then sometimes, though, what's interesting is even treating the underlying condition doesn't always completely improve the insomnia. So, for example,
that's interesting.
Yeah, with PTSD, the PTSD may improve significantly, but the insomnia may persist.
Does it work in reverse? Does treating the insomnia improve the underlying condition?
There is reciprocity there. So certainly if you're sleeping better, you're less susceptible to being vulnerable to the other manifestations or other sort of symptoms within those conditions.
I mean, I wonder if that's kind of used as a backdoor approach to these other conditions. You know what I'm saying?
No, that's a great point, and it's something that's actually debatable. There's not a consensus necessarily, because sometimes it is looked at as a symptom of another condition. I mean, it's reported that 90% to 100% of people with PTSD have insomnia as well.
Right.
It's not necessarily a prerequisite to only treat one at a time. I mean, they often go together so often.
So I want to end with Jake and with Roger. They've both been through a lot of trial and error and some pretty hairy experiences, to say the least. But what's clear is that they now have a process. They have steps they can follow. They have a protocol. They're not just sort of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And they're both now at places in their lives and their journeys that they can actually help other people as well and help them avoid some of the errors that they made in trying to get where they are. Let's hear Jake first.
I appreciate you taking the time and wanting to hear my story, just because that's what it's about for me. Is if one dude hears my story, it was like, oh man, I was in Iraq and I saw some fucked up shit, and this guy is smoking cannabis and it's helping him out. That's all I want. I want my story to be able to help someone else.
Yeah. So Jake, actually, he's part of the Santa Cruz Veterans Alliance, which is a cooperative of, I think it's 150, 250 veterans down in Santa Cruz area, and their whole mission is outreach to and support. So it's a support group, and they do a lot of work in terms of kind of spreading the word and working on things legislatively as well, and really helping others. So it's great to see that he's really taken a negative experience and turned it into something really positive.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of Roger, who we're gonna hear from at the end, and his work too. I mean, he
Grow for Vets. Grow for Vets, exactly.
Same thing. He talks about the financial impact,
the financial aspect of affording medicine, because it's not covered by insurance.
Exactly.
Obviously.
And so that's the work he does, trying to get that medicine to vets. Let's hear from him.
So cannabis changed my life. It saved my life. I'm sure everybody's well aware of all the toxicology reports of people that have Ambien and OxyContin in their bloodstream. Those are pretty common combinations. So I'm very blessed to discovered cannabis.
Let's leave it at that. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Seth. Again, we'd like to thank Leafly for sponsoring this podcast. Zana Health Lab is brought to you by Leafly, the world's largest cannabis information resource. Consumers and patients get more from cannabis at Leafly.